On recording. Yes. Okay. So it was this contact with Cubism in Paris that caused Franz Marc in Germany and Kirchner as well to move toward a more sharply angular form. And when we look at Cubism, one of the things that becomes apparent is that it's almost as if you're looking at refractions through a prism, only without the color, you know? Reflections at the same time. You know when you look at glass, a window, for example, you see both through the window, plus you see what's reflected on the window, right? And that's somewhat of the effect that you get with Cubist painting. It's almost as if you're looking through it, at the same time you're looking at it. And that's exactly the sort of effect that you get with this Franz Marc from the Phillips on the left, where he has the sort of Cubist effect in the way that the trees are both translucent or transparent and reflective at the same time, right? So Cubism is, in many ways, one of the most important movements of the 20th century, especially insofar as style is concerned, artistic style. It really had a huge impact on almost everybody working around 1909, 1910. And we've already seen it now with German Expressionism, and we'll see even people like Matisse pick up on some of their elements for a bit. But we don't get Futurism without the Cubists. We really don't get Piet Mondrian and style without the Cubists. I mean, they're everywhere. And primarily, however, just the style, not so much the theoretical ideas that they're working with, but rather this translucent, transparent, reflective style, based on sharp-edged angularity. That's really the Cubist revolution, and Picasso was at the center of it. He's the best known of the group. His dealer was a man named Henry David Kahnweiler. Here's a portrait of Kahnweiler, right? A Cubist portrait of Kahnweiler, where it's been reduced now, right, to these angles, these cubes, if you will. Where you can start to make out the part in his hair, you can see his eyes, you can see his eyes and his nose and his mouth, yes? Can you make it out okay? Yeah? Right, so, so, you know, there's the nose, there's an eye, there's an eye, there's a mouth, there's hair, right? You get all that, right? So you can make that out. And then there's also a sort of pyramidal shape to the figure, so that down below you start to get maybe hints of his crossed hands in his lap, the bottom, right? And flesh tone on that. But other elements that seem to look like the lapels of a coat, right? But, yeah, exactly. But totally distilled, right? Totally, and not like Kandinsky was doing. Yeah? It doesn't look like Kandinsky, but they're both taking what they see and they're distilling it to some different kind of essence, and then putting it back together again in the composition. So they share that. But you would never mistake a Picasso for a Kandinsky, because he's not only interested in color. He's totally interested in structure and shape. So in fact, part of this Cubist agenda in this early phase is to get rid of color almost entirely. Browns and grays. They're very, very neutral colors. These things reproduce really well in black and white, you know, because there really is so very little color there, so that we pay more attention to these forms that they're composing the picture with. Well, the reason I put Conrad Loeffler, even though he's not in your textbook, is first he was Picasso's dealer, right? And he's actually behind some of their projects. He puts them up to certain things, right? Puts them up to it. And he also wrote about Cubism and tried to explain the movement, what they were trying to do. And this would have had the approval of Picasso, right? This is, in other words, when Kahnweiler says this is what Cubism is all about, he's not just going to go off and crack off about this somewhere, right? Without Picasso thinking, yeah, this is really what it's all about. But Kahnweiler's a writer and Picasso's a painter, right? So he lets him go. And what Kahnweiler says, I'm not going to give you a direct quote or anything, but what he basically says is that the central agenda of Cubism, and this is something we've talked about with other movements, but the central agenda is to try to resolve a central tension in making painting. And that central tension is between the idea that a painting depicts an object, on the one hand, and the painting is an object, on the other hand. Okay? So there is this inert tension that's been there going back to the 19th century between the idea that a painting is this low-level three-dimensional object, paint on a canvas, right? Or on a surface. And I say low three-dimensional because usually we're talking about stretched canvases, right? But even with that, the layer of paint itself has texture. So you've got that object nature of a painting. But a painting is also its subject matter. Painting is also what it purports to illustrate from the world. And that is a tension in modern art that we have in a lot of it. That tension between the painting as object and the painting as subject matter, right? And what Kahnweiler says that both Picasso and the other artists in Cubism are trying to do, we'll look at the other ones, because in many ways Picasso is the best known, but others are maybe doing more adventurous things. Right? What he says that in order to resolve this problem, right, between the object and the subject matter, what Cubism does is to solidify space and pierce solids in making the composition. So anything that should be a solid is rendered as if it's transparent. And anything that should be a space, like background, like a void, like air, is rendered as if it were solid. So that you can knit together these two so that they become similar. Because as soon as you solidify nothing, and you nothingify, right? You render transparent a solid, then they become closer to being the same sort of thing as part of this composition. Right? There is no solid and void, right? What do we talk about when we talk about painting? Like the foreground background tension. There's a word I want here, you guys. Composition people. I don't paint anymore. The word to use for solids and voids. Do we still use that when we talk about positive negative space? There we are. That's what I'm trying to say. Right? The positive space becomes negative. The negative space becomes positive. Okay? So what we think of as negative space, which is the area around something, I'm going to draw Gracie, I would draw the area around your head, right behind you, that can become as solid as you are, and you can become as transparent as that which is behind you, right? And the reason for doing this is that, according to Kahnweiler, right, the reason for doing this is that once you destroy the difference between the object and the ground, positive and negative space, then you get rid of the idea of subject matter. You know? The painting really does become primarily an object, rather than an illustration of a subject. It's deep stuff, isn't it? So if you just keep the difference between subject matter and object nature, the painting has the nature of being an object. Right? It is an objectness. Yeah? It's a thing. The nature of being a thing. Not illustrating something, but being a thing. Right? So, for example, Kenny, you're writing on a tablet of paper, right? The words there are the thing. You know, and they're going to direct you to these other ideas. My words, the things you're seeing on the screen, whatever. Right? Nose to yourself. Hey, don't forget to let the dog out, or whatever. Okay? But really, it's a piece of paper with a bunch of scrawling on it. And so what Picasso and Braque are trying to do, well, we'll see Braque, and I dropped the bomb there, dropped the B-bomb. But what these artists are trying to do is to say that the essence of the painting as an object is really the thing that's the most important. And you have to destroy the essence of the painting as a subject matter in order to get there. And you can see how this is really similar to what Kandinsky's doing, and he had visited Paris as well, so they're cross-pollinating these ideas, right? But for Kandinsky, the idea is to get to a spiritual realm, yeah, that cancels out all the chaos of the world. And for Picasso, that's not the issue at all. It's really all about aesthetics. It's all just about making art. He has very little in the way of a political agenda, in the way of a social agenda. His is almost entirely an artistic agenda, which is to make a modern painting, to establish a new tradition, right? So, no distinction between the painted subject matter and the idea that the canvas is an object itself. By making the negatives positive and by making the positives negative, by making the solid physical and making the physical objects transparent. Right? And again, it's hard to make it not sound like Orwellian double speak, right? But does that clarify a bit what he's trying to do here? Is that questions on that? It's a tough thing, right? But it helps us understand what's going on here. And there's more to it than that, right? That's just getting us there, getting us started with the J.
So you're saying that it's all about just particular type of art, not necessarily anything political, or it's not trying to get a message, like a social message.
Indeed. And in fact, really what's interesting when we look back at this first decade of the 20th century, first 2 decades, is that the artists that are active in the French artists that are active in Paris, Matisse is the same way. There's something about it that is really more about art's own internal dialogues, right? So if we think about, when we think back to Matisse and the Clothes, right, he's trying to make an art that sums up everything that's happened up to this point, you know? But that's kind of internal within the art world. Whereas we look at the Germans, and they're much more politically engaged, right? Socially engaged. And I want to say socially is better than politically, because it's not about politics is office holding, right? All of that. Goodness knows over this weekend, you know, that's banded about worse than ever. And we'll see that the Italians are much more interested in a sort of a socio-political art. But the French less so. And I think there still is something to that eventually. That maybe there is something there. But, sorry? No, he's Spanish. He's an expat. So, you're right, I'm sorry. I said French artist working in France, and you're absolutely right. Picasso's a Spaniard. He is an expat, but he spends almost all his entire career after about 1940. I think so. I think there's something much more aesthetic about that, at least with Cubism, right? Now, we'll see there's some other interesting things insofar as, we've already sort of mentioned this, on one level, how are paintings made, right? That's one of the things he's really, when you make a painting, what do you need to be doing, okay? That's part of this dialogue. The other part is, how does a painting create and convey meaning? How does a painting give you the things you need to put together some semblance of an idea? Because paintings are really meant to communicate something. If that something's not politics, it's something else, right? And because of this idea that painting is supposed to communicate, Picasso, unlike Kandinsky, will never entirely abandon representation. You will always be able to look at a Picasso and figure out what it came from. Now, the titles often help, and sometimes it's more easy than other times. For example, the new woman on the right is just like, I really am almost at a loss, right, to figure out where she is in it. But then I start to think, okay, maybe I'm seeing shoulders, maybe I'm seeing where the head should be. If you imagine that being a woman, then you start to see that dizzy area up here, right, is probably based on the head and face. And the smaller details that one would see there, right? And then this area through here, probably the torso. And as you think that, and you start thinking about arms that might cross like an old Venus statue, then you start to begin to pull things into that, right? And then the bottom line is, or other element could be, that's just a guess, right? That area down there might be hips. It might be a seated figure. It's hard to say for sure, right? But it's certainly much more difficult than making out the element in the Kahnweiler over here. And even with Kahnweiler, you can tell he's seated and he's got a little desk there, a bottle of booze. Can you see that? Sit down over here in the corner, right? There's the top of the bottle, and he's sitting in his den, right? He's got his cigar box over there, probably a pipe, a little bottle of bourbon, something nice to drink on a nice cold evening, have a sniff of that as well. So he never abandons representation, right? It's always going to be there somewhere. Sometimes more difficult to see than others in this early phase. Now the one on the right, the one from the National Gallery, is really big. It's about 6 feet tall. And you can see the dimensions of it are rather awkward, aren't they? It doesn't look like your standard easel painting size, right? You're 18 by 24, you're 24 by 36, right? It doesn't have that proportion. It's tall and narrow, and that's because this was a commissioned piece to decorate the National Gallery picture. It was a commissioned piece to decorate a library, a private library of a patron, right? 11 paintings he commissioned from Picasso to decorate this mansion in Brooklyn, and inside the room with his books. And this is probably the first in the series. Picasso never completed the rest. It's incomplete, a series of pictures. So that was at least the basis for this. Right? So it can be difficult to read, but again, there's this idea of these angular forms, this melding of line, this disappearance of color, that all lie at the heart of Cubism. The other element about Cubism that's important to remember, so on one level we talked about the negatives becoming positive spaces, positive spaces becoming negative space, right? That's one level that makes Cubism. Another level is that each of these different facets of the cube, right? We're seeing, you can see why they call it Cubism. It looks cubic, And each of the different facets of the cube are meant to represent different points of view as well. This is that whole mirror window idea of reflecting and being transparent at the same time. That you get different points of view all at once. In other words, the work of art implies the passage of time. And with the passage of time, the idea that the viewer might move, which is in direct conflict to the entire history of Western art, where, going back to the Renaissance at least, art was based on the idea that you stay in one point, and they create a stay in one point perspective. Only works if you don't move and you close one eyeball. It doesn't work for stereo vision. But the way we really experience our world is through the passing of time. I understand this room because I move through this room. I understand what each of you look like because you turn and move, because I move, because time passes. That is how we understand our world, is by moving through it over the course of time. And Cubist pictures are trying to incorporate, I don't know if this is the right use of this word or not. I almost want to say it's existential. In other words, it's more about our existence and how we experience it, experiential way of understanding, rather than simply a descriptive way of understanding. Does that make sense? So in other words, paintings for years, realistic pictures, would just describe the way something looked from a single vantage point. For Picasso, that's not what he's trying to do. Right? What Picasso's trying to do is to give you a sense of what it meant to experience that object, rather than simply see it from a single vantage point. To truly experience in the way that you might experience it otherwise. So, okay, a coffee cup, right? In real life, you walk around it. You see the handle here, you move up here, you see the top. You understand that it's round even if you see it in perspective, right? I guess I should call it coffee cups for tea. Right? And it says one, it says Starbucks on one side and Tesla on the other. And I know because I experienced, right? And for a cubist to give us the essence of this cup and what it means to experience this cup, you can't just look at it from one point of view. Right? The experience of the cup is knowing the shape of that handle, knowing the roundness of this form, knowing the decorations that are on both sides of it, seeing it from the side, from the top, from the other side, simultaneously. Right? Incorporating the fourth dimension. This is really fascinating, isn't it? When you think about paintings, have always worked with the illusion of getting three dimensions, right? Think of all the stuff we make you do in studio, to draw in perspective, right? To modeling chiaroscuro, light and shade. It's all about the idea of making that flat surface give the appearance of a three-dimensional object, right? But once the surface doesn't try to do that anymore, right? That's the first principle. It's not trying to show us a three-dimensional solid in the void, in a space. It's trying to make a composition. Then it gives it the opportunity to incorporate something else. Time, passing. Without repeating things. You know what I mean? Like normally in past art, going back to the Renaissance, they wanted to show time passing, you see the same figure appear 2 or 3 times. So they could tell the story within a single frame. Right? Those of you who get through with me, that great Masaccio picture where you see Christ twice and St. Peter 3 times, the tribute money. Right? It just is normal. Or think about when you do comic books, right? You have panels. Okay? For Picasso, the idea of time passing is this idea that your vantage point, your relationship to the issue changes, or the object changes as you move around it. Right? And this idea that he's painting the fourth dimension, that he's painting a kind of art that sees a connection between space and time. I'm talking about three-dimensional space, right? And the idea that our experience of the world is dependent on time and movement. Big idea. A lot of scholars have said that this is based entirely on Einstein, who was in the news this week, right? The chirp. Did you hear about this? The chirp? The biggest thing to happen in physics since Einstein. Einstein said that space and time are not constant. We experience space and time in a way where we think that space is unified, it's constant, everybody sees it the same way and experiences it the same way. And that time is constant. That a second is a second is a second. A minute is a minute is a minute. And Einstein said, no, this is not true. The only constant in the world, or in the universe, is light and the speed at which it travels. And everything else is relative to that. And what he basically said was, and this is the whole idea behind black holes, is that time can slow down as gravity, the density of gravity gets too strong. Now, I'm not a physicist, so I'm going to muck this up, right? Did you see that movie with Matthew McConaughey, Interstellar? Did anybody see that? He goes to this planet where 20 minutes on the planet equals 7 years back home. Because time is elastic. And just this week, 2 black holes, well, just this week, 2 million years ago, or 2 billion years ago, 2 black holes collided. They sucked each other in. And it turned out, as they did, all of the energy that's wrapped up, it was like 35 times the weight of the sun, our sun. The other was like 27 times the weight of the sun, right? Kaboom! And as they came together, they gave off energy, so that they ended up with one thing that was a little bit less than all of it put together. That's what sent out energy. Gravitational wave system. And we picked it up on 2 different satellites. It's like the biggest thing that's happened in probably your lifetime as far as physics is concerned. Proved a theory he had in 1905 was proven this week to actually be true. That space and time are not consistent. This is mind-blowing stuff. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? But yeah, okay, this is more psychological, but you've been times when like the hour just goes by quickly. It's not like this class where it just drags on. Right? I think that we kind of have this idea that time is elastic anyway, based on how we feel with activity, but time is like something much more complex than that. Right? And he publishes these theories in 1905, 1906. The idea that space and time affect our perception. That's the bottom line. The way we perceive the world is not necessarily the way the world is. And it is utterly dependent on moving through space and the elapsing of time, neither of which are consistent for everybody. What's Picasso doing? He's making a painting that takes into account moving through time, moving through space, and the elapsing of time. Now, I'm not saying there's a cosmic thing, but a lot of people think that this new way of thinking about art, an art that addresses the fourth dimension of time, could not have been possible if ideas like Einstein were starting to circulate around. Yeah, deep stuff, right? It gets worse, or heavier, right? Because Cubism is primarily an aesthetic movement, but the ideas behind it are so fascinating because he's doing something utterly drastically different. Right? And so the whole, like I said, the whole idea, and I have to explain about it more, but the whole idea of the Renaissance, right, that you stood in one place and everything was based on measurements through space. As you didn't move, over the course of time, this is how we created a sense of three dimensions on a two-dimensional surface. This is, I think, a 1580 perspective manual of like these things. But Picasso's breaking that down, right? He's rejecting tradition. And if we have seen one thing happen in this class since we started, since day one, isn't the rejection of tradition sort of one of our major themes? And each one of them does it somewhat differently. Or at least maybe where your art fits relative to tradition, right? Because Matisse is kind of adopting it, in a different way. Well, like I said, he didn't do all that stuff. He worked with this other artist named Georges Braque, who is not as well known, but in retrospect, for many people over the last 15 years or so, have come to see, maybe more like 30, have come to see Braque as really like the innovator here. That Picasso's the guy we all heard of, but Braque came up with the ideas that Picasso developed fully. And with Braque's full knowledge and permission, they were collaborators. They shared a studio. In fact, Kahnweiler, who was just up there before, right, got them to work together. He saw what each one of them, you guys should share a studio. And for 5 years, 1909 to 1914, Picasso and Braque are working side by side, right, back to back, to the point where we think sometimes Picasso's over there mucking with Braque's canvases and vice versa, right? When later somebody asked Braque, what was it like sharing a studio with Picasso? One of my all-time favorite quotes. He says, we were like two mountain climbers roped together. You ever watch mountain climbers? One goes up, hammers in, sets the place, right? The other one's tethered beneath him in case he falls, yeah? And then at that point he waits there. The other guy climbs up and goes up further and sets the next piton, right? And then this guy will go up like that. We were like two mountain climbers roped together. Right? And even Braque's wife at the same time kind of piped in and said that the mountain was way too steep for either of them to have done alone. They needed each other in order to do this because, man, when they start working on Cubism, it just breaks and they are just pushing and pushing to where historians, you think your tests are tough, historians have been able to put it month by month how they're developing because they are churning out paintings just hand over fist. And people can look at the things and the motifs that they're using and just we can put it into a very, very precise timeline. End of May 1911. That sort of story. right? You don't have to worry about anything like that. You just have to get in a decade is all, and you're good. So nowadays we think that one of the things that's happened was that Braque was the one who inspired Picasso to move in the direction of what will become Cubism, and we'll trace this in a minute or two. Right, we'll look at that. When they arrive at this angular early Cubist style that we're looking at here, and you can see both of them have a kind of similar structure, don't they? There's a busy area up here, and then it can spread out. And, you know, it still has a sense of a figure against the ground, doesn't it? Although even this is an etching, right? Etching is dry point. So it's carved onto a plate. It's actually a really huge plate. 21 inches tall, this copper plate is, right there. You see that signature. How large this is. Kahnweiler gave him the plate and gave one to Picasso to let him work on the etching, you know, and so they did. But, and you can see that he still has some of the same rotation. He uses these little plucky lines down here. It seems the same sense as the brush strokes that we have in the process, right? And a busy area at the top that seems to spread out into broader lines toward the bottom and give it a sort of sense of balance, you know. I think we did the other way around, turn it upside down. It would here, not only would it sit on a point, but that busyness suggests the sort of thing that we're used to seeing. Again, trying to still maintain some reference points in the real world. So they go through the 1909, right? And they keep pushing each other up the hill. And many people now associate Braque with pushing it more quickly, more fully than Picasso did, and giving them the idea that Picasso could, and this is where it works really well, right? Think of great artistic collaborations over these years. Lennon and McCartney. Okay, the Beatles. Paul McCartney wrote these love songs. John Lennon wrote really experimental things, working together, wanting to take the other's ideas and find something that they have ideas to ends up making, you know, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, same thing, you know. He had all those love and blues stuff, all that great guitar work, and Mick, you know, was the greatest black singer in the city. Great artistic collaboration, right? And what Braque would do would bring these ideas to the table and Picasso would see the potential of where they might go from there. You know? They had that way of working side by side. So, in many ways, as we see this a lot, well, one is the innovator, and the other one is the laboratory. What could be done? And then the other one, how far can we push it in that direction? So, Braque's figure is picking up on many of the elements that you see in the New Woman, using the thin, you guys know how things are made? The copper plate in this case, you cover with a thin sheet of glass, and then you scratch through the glass, after which you immerse it in acid that carves your line. You also wax, and you push ink into the line. Okay? And then you run the paper on the top of it, and the ink from those engraved lines from the acid prints on the paper. Okay? And that means that on the north, if you look at the Braque on your left, the line, and you notice that all the tone tends to be very linear. Right? So the flex of the line that make up the tone. You can't get the same sense of rush with that. It's different, right? But he emulated that idea, as you can see in the lower right corner, for example. But there are still things here to be seen. Still recognizable elements. They've got some, you know, it's called thoughts, right? There's the word thoughts on the surface. Okay? Upper right corner. What else do you see there in the Braque? Numbers. And what numbers those are? 75 is good. Some people say maybe 15. The European 7s didn't have a splash in this level. Okay, but definitely either 75 or 15 here, right? What does that suggest to you? Heart right above it there. Gracie? Where would you see a heart like that? This weekend you wouldn't see it in one place, right? Valentine's Day, but what's a more likely place? Or a more common place than a Valentine's card? Sorry? In your home? Okay, that's a possibility too. You're thinking more metaphorically. What other kind of object would you see a heart? Okay. Even more common than that. Playing cards? Ace of hearts? Now there's no ace on it, but you'll notice the form around it has a card-like form, right? And as we begin to look at this, what we understand, I think I said that detail. Oh, back up. I'm so far out. Come back to that. There's nice detail on this as well. What he's working with here is a standard theme we see with Picasso and Braque around 1911. And that is the theme of a interior of a cafe. And again, with the idea that they're not going to illustrate what it looks like, but evoke the experience of it. Okay? So again, it's about spending time, right? Time elapsing. And as time elapses, even if you don't move, as soon as you move your head, you do, right? So you look over here, you look up here, you look over there, you look behind you. And you pull all of those visual experiences into a single picture that suggests the elaboration of time, or the elapsing of time, right? Fox, we know, was a bar that Picasso and Braque liked to go to, the Fox. That's the Fox. And it was an English bar in Paris, thus it's called the Fox and not Renard, which is the French word for fox, right? The Fox. And it's a British pub, right? They still exist all over the world, right? British tourists go there and get ripping and drunk, you know? They're kind of places, good places to avoid when you travel abroad is the British pub in the country, right? So with this idea that it is a pub, the 75 and the deck of cards become evocative of something else. It could be, the French had this system when my wife found some of these once, there's a whole stack, only about 10 of us, she bought them all. What they used to do when they give you the bill is kind of like what they do in dim sum, where they count up the dishes you've had and they bill you based on that. What they would do is if you had something, they would bring your drink on a little porcelain plate. And on the porcelain plate was the cost of the drink. Nice, right? And they would just stack them up there, and at the end of the day, okay, here's what I owe you, right? And the 75 could be 75 centimes, right? Or 15 centimes, which would be the cost of the drink from sitting there. And once you realize that maybe drinking is part of it, because we know that Fox is here, you start to see elements of like corks and bottles, perhaps, and alcoholic bottles or Mexican bottles. Over above that, old Tom gin, right? Labels that they seem, but they've been associated, right? They don't look like the labels that you see on the bottom itself, but they're derived from that, the experience as opposed, right? And I think that's kind of fascinating because he's interested in printed matter, or his print, right? What is the label but a print in itself? And he sort of peeled it off the bottom of his mind, right? And put it onto the surface. What's a card, a playing card, but a print, right? What's a bill? Even if it's printed on a plate, but a print. And he brought it into this, right? So once you see Old Tom gin, which is a brand of gin, right? But it was a brand of gin. And when we start to see the cards, we have to start to take other things out. These sort of background things here, suggesting perhaps cigarettes, other elements of things you might see at a bar. I also observed that 75 was slang for cheating at dice. Right? You roll a 75. So 75 is 12, right? But you can't roll a 75 because dice only go up to 10, right? So 6 is good. That makes 12. That's a win, right? But at 75, we're saying 12 is good. It's not easy to keep. So that paired with the cards suggests also this idea, low stakes gambling as well. Evoking the experience without showing us anything about it, right? There's no interior, there's no wall, there's no bottle that you can make out sitting on a table. In other words, it's kind of like a robot, like those things on the table. With that peppermint bottle, that schnapps bottle sitting on the table there. And like they thought, we broke up the stage and put it back together again. Gotham and Rock, in this particular case, are also sort of reorganizing the different elements. Right? Not putting it back together again to replicate observed objects, but putting it back together with the idea of composition and evoking an experience that takes not only time into account, but also movement into account, where solid and void are impossible to tell. Now, Picasso and Braque had a term for this phase of cubism that we're talking about, and that's what I had up there a second ago. Analytic cubism. Cubism as a movement really falls into two basic phases. And the early phase, analytic cubism, is where the artists are focusing on analyzing what they've seen. Okay? So the big part of the artistic practice is to take the visual world and break it down. That's what analysis is. You break it down to its constituent elements. And then they put it back together. Right? But the heavy lifting is the analyzing. Right? What we'll see is the second half is different. The second half of cubism does something really very, very different from that. Has some of the standard hallmarks that moves in a totally different direction. So this is analytic cubism in a nutshell. It's taking what you've seen, analyzing it, paring it down, distilling it. Right? That's the brunt of the work. And that's the work you see on the canvas or on the printed page. One of the things that's really quite interesting about Cubism in general is the degree to which how so many Cubist objects focus on a very limited number of themes. We could talk about a Cubist object. That within these different still lives, within these different images, they keep coming back to the same sorts of things. Coffee cups is a big one. Sitting at a cafe table is a huge theme. Music is a big theme. Guitars and bottles. They love these things. And I think part of it is the fact that they're machine-made in a way. I mean, there's something so beautiful and analyzed about a guitar. Some icky guy going, but the guitar, right? The body of the guitar and the smoothness of the wood on the side of the guitar, how it's been also analyzed in a way, distilled, and the sharp edges with the hole. And the guitar is great, right? Because it's a solid, but it isn't. It's a hollow with a hole through it. And even the strings that stretch across the top of the guitar become this thing that creates space, but it isn't a solid, right? Because you see through the strings to the neck underneath it, or through the hole to the guitar underneath it. It becomes this amazing, and the bottle is the same thing, right? You can look at it, palm in, and you can look through it. And you look through it differently in the part that's empty or the part that's full. But even when it's full, you can see through it. Right? Gin's clear bottle, clear liquid. They do know that. Right? And allows you sort of to transform the way you view the world by looking through these things. So everything is about mucking up perspective, right? We see the table both from the side and from the top at the same time. We see objects from the side, from the top at the same time. We see labels divorced from the thing that they label and placed in a different part of the composition. Nothing really fits back together in the way that we're used to, jarring us free from tradition and really what we are used to seeing. This one you might remember from intro class, and this is why I kept bringing up the cars, because they really do loom large in Cubist works. In this case, the Portuguese was a man he saw playing a guitar at a cafe, and there was a boat outside sitting in a dock, and so you can start to see that there are these elements, like up here, there's a pier with a rope on it, right? And then down below here, you can see the elements of the guitar and the strings that come across, and how they've been repeated as well. Right? Pull that compositional element out of the strings, and he stamped it back onto the composition in various places. So, again, it's not trying to put it back together in a unified way where space and time are constant, but rather in a way that relates to the idea of sitting there for a bit. And then our Portuguese, right? We have the head in this sort of area here, and the guitar down below, and even the sense, I think, when you strum a guitar, the way the strings move, he's trying to capture that as well by repeating them over and over again. What's fascinating is that Braque begins to use this idea of words. And you'll notice the degree to which, in addition to being a picture about objects that have been broken up, right, and made less object-like, it's also, in Braque's hands, a picture about words. Thoughts, old Tom Jim, that's 75. Here, we've got B-ball, OCO, upper left. We have other things that look even more right here, 0,40, which certainly seems more like 40 centimes, since the Europeans use commas rather than periods for decimal points. Is there a 1 there? I don't think that's a pattern. It could be, but it's almost this twist space. And what's fascinating about that, though, and it could be, I haven't seen this person in body, but what's fascinating about that is that Braque is, here he's actually scratching the letters in, right? This idea of freedom. Here he's using real time painter stencils right onto the surface of the canvas, right? And in fact, Braque, before he was an artist, was in fact a sign painter as well, commercial sign painter. He knew how to stencil anyway. And I think that, for me, this is utterly fascinating that he's doing this because it's graffiti almost, right? I just kept watching this thing about Page, the British stencil graffiti artist, right? And it's like, well, here it is, 100 years ago, you know? But what's fascinating to me also about stenciling is that you'll notice the upper front of the ampersand as well, right? Is that he stenciled these areas where it looks like he's almost trying to illustrate something, like the wooden sphere and the rope that wraps around him because he's looking out of this harbor bar window and sees a boat out there. Right? So he's bringing elements of that in. It's almost as well as if there's a steamboat chimney at the very, very top that he sees from that same window, right? And at these areas where he gets perilously close to actually illustrating something recognizable, right? He comes right back over the top of it, and he stencils on the surface. So, remember what Carlisle said about the fact that the central crux of Cubism was the distinction between the object that is a painting and the subject that it represents, right? Here, at the moment when it starts to represent something, right back on the top of something reasserts that it's an object, that is a flat surface, that is not a pier in the road. Right? It just snaps you right back to that, and these words never really, I think it's sort of wrong to think that I can even figure out exactly what that thing comes from, right? Because he's made a point as he develops this idea, and I think the print is a little bit more straightforward on it. But here, what is B-ball? Bow, right? And some people suggested that it might be a poster advertising a party ball, and party run ball, a large, get together. OCO, anybody's guess. Rococo, the French art movement from the 18th century, we see referencing that to that. Who knows? The point is, if he wanted you to know, he'd have told you. Don't you think? If he really wanted you to lock down a single meaning, either with those letters or with the forms, he'd have told you. What he wants to do is to complicate the relationship between the producer of the meaning, Rob, and the receiver of the meaning, you and me. And by complicating that issue, right, it puts it to you. It really emphasizes your role in all this, doesn't it? That the meaning is, in part, up to you to decide, up to you to put that together again. You're a detective with incomplete evidence. You're a doctor with symptoms you've never seen. It's up to you to try to put it back together. And he's given you enough to go places, but not enough to go only one place. Okay.
Should we lettering from, how shipments have a specific font of pencil and you see it on barrels and container ships, and he is at
at a harbor. Yeah, I think the idea of objects that have stencils on them, right, or objects that have words on them, is kind of a fascinating one in and of itself. Okay, and it's something that we see here, right, with Old Tom Gin on the left, or even the idea of the Fox Bar, right? That's the sign for the Fox Bar. So the idea of an object that has a word on it that identifies the object is, I think, something that absolutely fascinates. And it does sort of put me to the next point, which is the even more complicated issue. Because if you think about an object with a word on it, okay? Sometimes the word on an object identifies the object, the gin bar, right? Sometimes the word on an object has nothing to do with the object the word is on. If it were a poster, for example, for a ball, and that's what Lucky suggested, but I like the idea of a barrel that has been marked. But going back to the idea that the poster, when you put the word ball on a wall, it doesn't make the wall into a party, right? But that idea of the disconnect sometimes between the words that label things and the thing itself. Right? I think something that fascinates him. That linguistically, right? Because really it's all about how do words create meaning and put it back together. Right? That linguistically, sometimes things are labeled in a way that they're not. Maybe that's why the thing that says gin has nothing to do with a bottle of gin. You know what I mean? Can you see a bottle of gin near that? Maybe that's the top of the gin seen from the top. I don't know. Right? This semicircle here. Right? Because you look down at the neck at the top, right, you would see it as a perfect circle. And then maybe some disconnected lines around it. I don't know, are these glasses here on the table, right? But the idea that you pull the thing that says gin off of the bottle of gin, it's kind of fascinating because the bottle itself is gin. It's nothing inside the bottle. So he's taking this label that's identified and yanking it apart, right? He's separating it out. And like I said, this, for me, I think intellectually, not only that, I think Cubism is really great aesthetic. I think that when you pare it down to no colors whatsoever, how do you make that work? When you're working really only with form and a single color. And working with the idea of experience and moving through time, it's a whole amazing thing. But there's this other element that is about how does art create meaning? Big question. How does art create and also convey meaning? We've sort of been touching and dancing around this idea, right? That art for Picasso for Rock is creating a meaning based on experience, right? Creating a meaning based on elapsed time as an element of experience. But the words, the half words especially, the weird words, the strange words, that experience, not only do they reassert, they function to reassert the fact that this is a flat surface, an object that you can move on to, that has nothing to do with the Portuguese or a guitar. It's an object, a square object. They reiterate that, but they also point to there's a disconnect of sorts between a symbol and its meaning. And if we think outside the box here, a symbol might be a bottle. It might be the label on a bottle. It might be a word on your cage. Priscilla, what's the last word you wrote down there? The very last word. Example? Okay, very good. Why does that set of 7 letters, right? Why do we know what that means? Why do we know what does the word example mean and why does it mean that? And I don't expect to have an answer for this, right? This is this bigger question about perception, right? Why do symbols, the letters on your page, mean anything at all? Why does a word, right? This one gets tapped. Right? Why does this mean? Right? Why does cat mean that? Why does that mean cat? Right? Why do either of these things mean that purring thing that curls around the teeth? Right? Why can a representation point us to that? Why can the word cat point us to that? This is sort of a culturally learned connection, right? And the only reason a cat means that and not caterpillar, land mover, right? Snow cat, snowmobile, right? Is for contact, right? There are the other sets of symbols that are around. The only reason you can identify that as a cat and not money is because of where I put it on the board next to that word, right? That left on its own, you'd be left to guess what the hell is he doing, right? Right before class, right? It's the concept that gives us the meaning. It's the relationship to the other objects there. So, fox here doesn't mean fox, right? Like a cat or a dog. Fox here means farm because of the rest of it. Okay? Now, this is the reason I'm kind of diving into this so deeply is that this was a new theory about how language works that was first published in 1910 in Paris. Right? This idea that language, the study of language is the study of a system of symbols, of signs. And that the connection between the sign, the symbol, and the thing that it referred to was fluid. It didn't always point the same direction. And that the only way you knew what direction it pointed was based on the things that were around it. Okay. So like I mentioned cat, the only way we know what we're talking about with cat, or I think other words we could use. What word is this? What does this word mean? Say that out. What word is that? Wig. How do you know? Is that a word that could be? Okay, wind equals breeze, right? Wine. Why isn't it wine? Wine something around something, right? The only way we know which of these it is, right, is wine forward, right? The only reason we know what it is whatever words came before and after the sentence. We wouldn't know otherwise. Now, yeah, but the point is, it's the concept, isn't it? The meaning of that word, the symbolism of that word, this is the signifier, which is what they call it, right? This is what it signifies. The signified. This connection is not solid. This connection is fluid. And it's based on the context of the signifier. I guess this is heavy stuff, right? But if we think about what Picasso is doing, he's divorcing these things from it so that he makes this fluid instead of direct. Right? He makes it fluid. He opens it up so that you don't have to agree with me about it insofar as reading what those things mean. Right? And I mentioned, okay, I think the one's too far away from zeros. He can, but you don't have to agree. He opens it up. Right? This is a part that allows you to have every bit as much say in its communication as Brock. I find that liberal. I think that's just great. You know? There are certain elements that we can talk about what he attempted to do, some things that help us to read it and slightly better. But the bottom line is, these works of art are intended to break down the connection between a symbol of an object, the signifier, and the thing that it signifies, the signified, right? And that is exactly what we find in this linguistic theory that became popular around 1910, 1911. And in particular in Paris, but with offshoots all over Europe. Art is a language, just like words are languages. And they only take on meaning based on the context that the artist creates. But he separated it. Analytic cubism separates them from the context. Puts it all back together and again to allow you to develop meaning of it. Another of these bar pictures, and I've been trying to use local works as much as I can here. And you can see, well, take a look at it. What are the elements that tell you that this is another of these bar pictures? How do you know? Other than Mark telling you. Again, words, pictures coming together. It's called bath. Not face, right? But bath. And I'll tell you that. I mean, even though by just working in any context, how do you know it's not face, as in cello? Right? We talk guitars over here. Why is it not a face? What is a bath? It's a fish, right? But not in French. Right? I don't know what bath is in French. You see the word bath? Upper right corner, more or less, right? It's a beer. Bath ale. No, they haven't changed the label in forever. Right? It's been brewed since I read 1777. Not that I know that. But go buy it the same way. They sell it. Bath ale. there are other words here that point us towards this interpretation of this as an evocation of a pub, an evocation of a bar. E-I-N, not Windsor Diesel, from the action movie, right? Does you hear know any French? What is pizza? Qu'est-ce que c'est le mot vin? V-I-N. My French teacher when I was an undergrad, and still a good friend of mine, said the way that you understand the French nasal sound is to say this word, un bon vin mort. So just all of it, un bon vin mort. All of that in, right? A good white wine. That is wine. So we have that element as well, up to the end of it. Lower right, almost title, cafe. All of these words are a little bit more direct than in his painting of the Portuguese, but pointing us towards these elements. I gotta detail that, right? And then there. What's that thing that almost looks like a machine with a rotary arm on it, right? This bit here, what is that? Do you think? Cigarette and ashtray? You see those a lot in these cafe pictures. Because it's a cafe picture is the perfect thing for Picasso or Braque to do for these, because when you go to a cafe in France, it's like it's an extension of your house. You get a local, they know who you are, and you can sit there and nurse one cup of coffee for 4 hours and read the paper all day long, and no one will tell you to leave. Right? Exact opposite of America, right? We just get out of here, we got to get the next round in. If you're not going to worry anything, give up the tape, right? Now, sit outside, watch the world go by, right? Enjoy the elapsing of time. And they're giving us these elements that are meant to relate directly to that. Directly beneath that element, you see there's more words there, aren't there? J-O, and then part of something. Probably a U. We see this in other Braques. It's the first 3 letters of the French word for newspaper. Journal, journal. It's the French word for newspaper. And Le Journal is one of the prominent dailies in Paris. So he's again evoking this idea of nursing his drinks, having a smoke, reading the paper. Fascinatingly, and Picasso does this too, by separating out the journal, J-O-U, is a derivation of the French word to play. Wish my wife here to keep this. So J-O-U, journal, right? It's the same word as day, sure. So there's also the way it's set up here, you get a whole thing, right? But certainly they extended it, right? J-E-U means right. Okay? And just Tuesday, right? But J-O-U by itself, which you can see the similarity. Again, we're saying that this connects between meanings, words and meanings, right? Fragments of words and meanings. This also means the same, but it is not. Right? Textual. And both the Picasso picked up. And in fact, there are these risks. I don't know this because I'm not read enough about this. There are these three-dimensional forms that take on a certain life force, even knowing what that word means on its own, independent from the journal that it illustrates. So, Picasso, Braque, and analytic cubism, right, have moved toward this idea of an art that symbolizes, right? And the theory that I was talking about, this idea of the relationship between signifier and signified, is called semiotics. And this is a brand new way of analyzing literature based on how authors construct meaning by linking together different independent signifiers that only take on meaning based on how they are conjuncted, is that a word? Conjoined? Conjoined with other signifiers, right? So that relationship then between the signifier and the signified seems to be something very much that Picasso and Brock are both dealing with. Both. We'll get there we'll do that on. This is still analytic cubism, right? And we'll see that the second half is really kind of signaled by what Brock is doing here, by putting words on there, because once he starts to stencil the words on there, and in fact with this one, what's really fascinating too is, you see up here, it looks like wood grain. You see that sort of cyclone? That he's actually trying to bring, that's wood grain. The next step of cubism is where instead of putting words on the table, instead of putting wood grain, so why draw it when I can just bring it in? So we'll see pieces of paper slammed onto the surface, pieces of wallpaper, tablecloth from the cafe, the real rope, a real tabletop, a stencil of a chair pot brought into it. That's the second. Where instead of analyzing it, it's constructed. So you want synthetic cubism, synthesize. It's a simple act of bringing this stuff together rather than tearing it apart. Right? So we'll do that next Tuesday or so, but Friday I'll look at getting us down to the creature. Right? I'll let you know as soon as I know anything. It's probably too late to get a hold of that office today. So I think it's really on fairly quick notice, and I'll try first thing in the morning to get us down there, and then also find out from the creative that we can get it pretty small in campus. Okay? So look for an email outlining the details of the script. You guys don't want, you guys mind that we're so far behind? That bothers you. Bothers me. Like, it's one of the end of the term. It really does. Yeah, get there. But I'm going to we'll work through some other things quickly that we just don't have in this. So I will see you on Friday, either in front of main house or here, if we can't look it up that quickly. Okay?